The realtor had used the word idyllic no less than 5 times during the walkthrough, and for once I thought they weren't lying. The house itself was a charming, if slightly dated, 2-story, but the backyard was the main event. It wasn't just a yard. It was a gradual, gentle slope of emerald green grass that ran directly into the shimmering surface of Crystal Lake. I could already picture it. My morning coffee on the dock, the gentle lap of water against the shore, and most importantly, a daily swim before work. I'm a writer, and the thought of breaking through a bout of writer's block with a brisk, solitary breaststroke felt like a superpower. The HOA packet was the only cloud on the horizon. My lawyer, a pragmatic man with tired eyes, slid the thick binder across his desk. "Standard stuff for the most part," he'd said, tapping the cover. "But read it. They're thorough." That was an understatement. The rules covered everything from the specific genus of permitted shrubbery, no excessively droopy willows, to a clause that seemed to suggest wind chimes required a permit. I skimmed the section on waterfront regulations, but it was dense with legalese about dock maintenance and runoff. The word swimming never jumped out at me, and in my blissful ignorance, I assumed that the freedom to plunge into the body of water I now owned a portion of was an unalienable right, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of a perfectly manicured lawn. I signed on the dotted line, my mind already out on the water, completely unaware that I was also signing away my autonomy to Brenda Henderson and her committee of aesthetic enforcers. The letter felt absurd in my hands, the formal language so comically out of sync with the supposed crime. Aesthetic disruption? I muttered to myself, standing in my kitchen. Was my serene, almost silent swimming really causing a ripple in the fabric of the universe? I decided the best approach was a friendly, face-to-face chat to clear up what I assumed was a simple misunderstanding. I walked over to Brenda's house, the notice in my back pocket. Her home was a perfect, symmetrical monument to beige, with not a single blade of grass out of place. It felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled Suburban Conformity. She answered the door with a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Michael, I assumed I'd be seeing you." I explained as calmly as I could that the lake was the entire reason I'd moved here. Her smile never wavered. "The lake is for the enjoyment of all residents," she clarified, as if reading from a hidden script. "Its primary purpose is visual serenity. The reflective quality of the water at dawn is a designated community feature. Splashing, frankly, distorts that reflection." Then she delivered the masterstroke about my swim trunks. I was so stunned I just stared at her. She actually produced a color swatch card from a drawer in her foyer table, pointing to a range of muted grays and browns labeled lakeside earth tones. "Vibrant colors can be visually jarring from a distance," she explained. I left her porch feeling like I'd just argued with an alien who had learned about human interaction from a poorly written manual. The pettiness wasn't just annoying. It was a form of artistry. For a week, I was too furious to even look at the lake. The sheer audacity of the fine was breathtaking. $1,000. That was more than my property taxes for the quarter. It felt less like a penalty and more like a ransom demand for my sanity. I drafted a dozen scathing emails, each one more sarcastic and legally precarious than the last, but I deleted them all. A direct confrontation seemed like playing chess with a pigeon. They'd just knock over the pieces and strut around like they'd won. So I decided to test the waters, so to speak. I went to a sporting goods store and found the most pathetically beige, khaki-colored swim trunks I could find. They looked like something a park ranger would wear on a swamp tour. The next morning, I slipped into them and waded into the lake with the solemnity of a monk performing a ritual. I swam a slow, deliberate, and utterly silent breaststroke, making barely a ripple. I was a ghost in the machine, a neutral-toned specter haunting my own property. I even made sure to do it at 6:30 a.m., when the only witness would be the sun and, presumably, Brenda's motion-activated sense of outrage. I thought my display of malicious compliance would prove a point. But when the next cream-colored envelope arrived, its weight feeling like a lead brick, I realized the point was never about the rules. It was about the power. The fine was unchanged, the language now threatening a lien. The war was no longer cold. The moment I saw that second notice, something inside me shifted. The calm, reasonable homeowner was gone, replaced by a patient, methodical strategist. Paying the fine was out of the question. It would be funding my own oppression. So, I decided to fight fire with the pettiest, most bureaucratic water fight imaginable. My kayak became my weapon of choice. The bylaws prohibited unsupervised paddling, a hilariously vague term. I dug out my old kayak instructor certification from a summer job in college. It was dusty, but it was official. My paddling was now, by definition, professionally supervised. I went online and ordered a kayak in solar flare orange, a color so aggressively vibrant it probably violated several local aviation laws. I would paddle for hours, right along the shoreline in front of Brenda's house, sometimes pausing to just float and stare at her window, humming the Jaws theme. I could feel her seething from 100 yards away, a palpable wave of frustration. But she was trapped. The bylaws said nothing about watercraft color, and my certificate was a perfect, infuriating shield. It was my first real victory, a small but intoxicating taste of turning their own absurd rules against them. And it taught me a crucial lesson. To beat the beast, I had to know its anatomy better than it knew itself. It was time to stop skimming the rulebook and start dissecting it. Of course. Armed with a pot of strong coffee and a highlighter, I declared war on the CC and RS. I transformed my dining room table into a command center, the massive binder open like some ancient, malevolent tome. The legalese was a dense fog, but I pushed through, cross-referencing articles, subsections, and amendments. I felt like a conspiracy theorist connecting red strings on a corkboard, except my clues were real. The nuisance clause was my first breakthrough. It explicitly mentioned noise, fumes, and light pollution, but said nothing about splashing or aesthetic disruption. Brenda had been applying a subjective, personal interpretation to a vaguely written rule. But that was just a defensive finding. I needed an offense. That's when I remembered Bylaw 4.1, the Architectural Integrity Rule. It was the HOA's nuclear option, governing every external change. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered the community picnic flyer from last summer. There, in the background of a photo of Brenda serving lemonade on her perfect patio, was the corner of a brand new, professionally built garden shed. A shed I had never, ever seen on any meeting's agenda for architectural approval. The hypocrisy was so perfect it was almost poetic. She had built a permanent, non-compliant structure while fining me for a splash. Of course. My kayak-based pettiness had been fun, but this was serious. I needed irrefutable evidence. I became a suburban spy, my phone my primary weapon. I started taking evening walks with my dog, my route meticulously planned to pass Brenda's property. That's when I hit the jackpot. As dusk fell, her backyard erupted in a blaze of light. She had installed a series of powerful, commercial-grade floodlights along the back of her house, presumably to showcase her impeccable lawn or deter any rogue fireflies. The glare was so intense it lit up Mr. Gable's bedroom window across the street like a movie screen. I immediately started recording, making sure to capture my watch showing it was 10:18 p.m., well past the nuisance curfew. The next day, I filed a formal, typed complaint, citing Bylaw 11.2 verbatim. The auto-reply promised a review, but weeks passed with no action. Meanwhile, I chatted up Mr. Gable, who was more than happy to complain about that woman's lighthouse, and confirmed the shed had appeared overnight with no permits or notices. I even found a landscaping company's truck parked outside her house one Tuesday, and, posing as a curious neighbor, learned they were installing a new perennial border around the president's shed. Every piece of information was a bullet, and I was loading my magazine for the big meeting. Of course. The air in the community center was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and simmering resentment. I sat near the back, my binder of evidence on my lap. Brenda ran the meeting with brisk, unquestioned authority, ticking off mundane items until she reached mine. Her tone was dismissive as she announced the impending lien. That was my cue. I stood, my voice calm but clear. Actually, Brenda, before we proceed with that, I believe there are more pressing violations the community needs to address. I held up my binder. Specifically, violations originating from Lot 17. The room went quiet. I detailed the unapproved shed, presenting the photo from the picnic flyer. Brenda's face flushed. "That is a temporary storage unit," she snapped. "It's on a concrete foundation," I replied coolly. "But more immediately, you are in violation of Bylaw 11.2, the nuisance clause, for your exterior floodlights." I described the excessive light pollution after 10 p.m. That's when Mr. Gable erupted. "It's true. I've had to buy blackout curtains. It's like living in a prison yard. The dam broke." A woman shouted about her $250 fine for a pink garden gnome. Another man stood, waving a letter about his unauthorized bird feeder. The room erupted into a chorus of long-suppressed grievances. Brenda stood frozen at the podium, her authority evaporating in the face of the rebellion her pettiness had created. Of course. Here is an extended version of Chapter 8. The silence that followed the community uprising was more powerful than any gavel. Brenda stood shell-shocked at the podium, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The vice president, a man who had always been her silent accomplice, slowly stood and moved to take the microphone from her. I think a motion is in order," he said, avoiding Brenda's gaze. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, effective immediately." The ayes that roared through the room were nearly unanimous. Brenda gathered her papers with trembling hands and fled the room without another word. In her place, Raj, the quiet engineer, was elected by acclamation. His first act was to call for a vote to repeal the no-swimming bylaw. Passed in seconds, met with actual applause. But my personal victory came later. I met with Raj and the new board, presenting a formal petition. I argued that the $1,000 fine was not just an error, but a bad faith abuse of power designed to harass, not to govern. I cited the clause I'd found that allowed for the reimbursement of legal fees in such disputes. I may not have hired a lawyer, I told them, but I spent dozens of hours acting as my own, researching bylaws and building a case to defend my home from an unjust attack. My time has value. The new board, eager to distance themselves from Brenda's regime and establish a new era of fairness, agreed. They couldn't directly reimburse my time, but they could assess a special fee to cover legal costs the HOA had ostensibly incurred from the dispute. And so, they voted to charge Brenda and her two most loyal cronies a $5,000 special assessment, which was then issued to me as a reimbursement. The poetic justice was so sweet I could almost taste it. Now, every time I fire up my new, top-of-the-line grill, paid for by the Brenda tax, and then dive into the lake for a sunset swim, I'm reminded that sometimes the best way to fight petty tyranny isn't with a shout, but with a deeper, smarter understanding of the rules and the courage to enforce them against those who wrote them.